Neil Diamond is not just a pop rock legend. He is the heartbeat of America, the living soul of a nation that found its voice through his songs. He gave the world Sweet Caroline, a song that echoes through stadiums, resonating across generations of love and loss, becoming an immortal melody of joy and memory. But behind that golden voice is a man who has walked through storms that few could ever survive, rising from a poor boy in Brooklyn, climbing from pain and rejection, to become one of the most beloved singer-songwriters in history. Two broken marriages, distant children, and a loneliness so heavy that fame could never heal it. Every wound, every sleepless night, every tear. He turned into music to heal millions of hearts. Even as his own heart bled, he didn't just perform. He bled on stage, turning suffering into art, despair into devotion, and sorrow into something sacred. But then, when the stage lights faded, fate struck its final blow. At 84, Parkinson's has been merciless, turning the final years of his life into tragedy. Don't look away, because what he is enduring now may be the deepest, most painful chapter of this legend's life. And if his music has ever touched your heart, leave a like as a tribute to the man who gave the world everything and still has never stopped giving. It's cruel how some lives begin with heartbreak long before the world even notices. Some hearts are born with cracks too deep for childhood to heal, and Neil Diamond's was one of them. His story didn't begin with fame, but with silence, the kind that seeps through thin walls, humming in small Brooklyn apartments where dreams are rationed like bread. The world would one day call him a legend, but in the beginning, he was just a quiet boy trying to survive between the echoes of war and the weight of his parents' unspoken fears. He was born on January 24, 1941, in Brooklyn, New York, as the world tore itself apart in World War II. His parents, Akiba Kiev Diamond and Rose Diamond, were Jewish immigrants from Russia and Poland, two souls who carried faith in their hands and hunger in their pockets. His father peddled dry goods door to door, chasing nickels through the cold, while Rose kept the household stitched together with prayer and patience. Winters were cruel. The wind slipped through window cracks. The heat barely held. The family moved from one cramped apartment to another, never staying long enough to plant roots or catch their breath. Neil learned early that nothing stayed. Not warmth, not security, not even love's gentle touch. When his father was drafted into the army, the fragile calm of their small world shattered. Rose gathered what little they owned, holding her two boys close as she boarded a train bound for Cheyenne, Wyoming, a place so vast and foreign it might as well have been another planet. There were no familiar voices, only the whistle of the wind and the ache of distance. At night, while his mother mended clothes under a dim bulb, Neil wandered into the local cinema. He sat for hours in the dark, watching the singing cowboys on screen, their voices steady, their hearts unbroken. Those melodies reached him in a way words never could. That's where he learned that a song could make loneliness sound beautiful. Years later, he would look back and say softly, "It wasn't an easy home, but it was filled with love and a lot of silence." I think music became the way I talked to the world when words didn't work. When the war ended, the Diamonds returned to Brighton Beach, where salt air mixed with the sweat of working families chasing the same uncertain dream. The boy who had watched his father disappear into uniform now watched the ocean and wondered if he'd ever belong anywhere. He was shy, inward, always observing. The boy who felt everything too deeply. While other kids played stickball in the streets, Neil scribbled poems on scraps of paper, trying to turn confusion into clarity. Then at 15 came the miracle, a $9 guitar, a gift from his parents that they could barely afford. It was chipped, out of tune, but to Neil it was salvation. He sat for hours in the glow of a single lamp, teaching himself chords until his fingers bled. The guitar wasn't a toy, it was a lifeline. It gave his silence a sound, a way to translate ache into something the world might understand. That same year he wrote his first song, "Hear Them Bells," for a girl at school. What began as a teenage crush became something sacred. The realization that music could make him feel seen even when no one was looking. By 16, his grades had slipped, but his spirit had awakened. The son of a door-to-door salesman, the child of immigrants who had weathered war and want, Neil Diamond had already learned the difference between hunger and desire. He wasn't starving for food, he was starving for meaning. And in that hunger lay his destiny. He was just a small boy from Brooklyn, holding a guitar too big for his hands, and somehow it fit him perfectly. Every legend begins somewhere small, but few begin in hunger. For Neil Diamond, the road to music was not a path lined with applause, but with silence, rejection, and the cold bite of loneliness. The same boy who once whispered songs into the walls of a Brooklyn apartment now faced the brutal question every dreamer must answer. How much pain are you willing to carry for what you love? In those early years, survival was an art form. He counted coins in the shadows so no one would see how small his dreams had become. Sometimes he pressed his guitar against his chest, not to play, but to feel something warm. The city didn't pity him, and he didn't ask it to. He just kept walking, his hunger louder than the noise of New York. In 1958, the world expected Neil Diamond to become a doctor. He had earned a fencing scholarship to New York University, studying pre-med with a steady hand and an unsteady heart. While his classmates memorized anatomy charts, Neil's mind drifted toward melodies. Between lectures, he'd sneak away to Tin Pan Alley, guitar in hand, knocking on the doors of publishing houses that smelled of cigarette smoke, ink, and ambition. "Can I play you something?" he'd ask, voice trembling with hope. Most days the answer was no, the kind of no that doesn't just close doors but dreams. Still, he returned the next day and the next. Every rejection added another brick to his resolve. Every slammed door a reminder that the only one left open was the one he built for himself. By 1960, he made a choice that changed everything. He walked away from college, just 10 credits short of a degree, to take a $50 a week job writing songs at Sunbeam Music Publishing. It wasn't a job. It was a gamble with fate. $50 to chase a dream in an industry that chewed up and spat out hopefuls like him. The office was small, the piano out of tune, and the winters merciless. He wrote until his hands cramped, his stomach empty but his heart full. Too sad, they said, too strange. He was too honest for a business built on imitation. When Sunbeam let him go, Neil found himself adrift in Manhattan, young, broke, and invisible. His world shrank to a rented room, his hope to a whisper. He lived on 35 cents a day, enough for coffee and a roll if luck was kind. Some nights he wandered the streets just to stay warm. He slept where the city forgot him, above Birdland, in a dusty storage room that echoed with jazz from below. He'd sit at a broken piano, his breath fogging in the air, and play until his fingers bled. "I wrote," he later said, "because I had nothing else." Every no became a scar, and every scar became a song. In 1962, Columbia Records offered him a small lifeline, a single called Clown Town. It sank without a trace. Another door closed, another piece of pride lost, but he kept going. Failure had become a familiar companion, one he carried like a shadow. Then in 1965 came the spark that kept him alive. "Sunday and Me," a song he wrote for Jay and the Americans, broke into the top 20. For the first time, the world sang back his words. It wasn't fame yet, but it was validation, proof that pain could be melodic. Yet even as light broke through, darkness lingered. Signing with Bang Records brought success, but also chains. They wanted sugar. Neil would later say, "I gave them blood." He wanted truth. They wanted hits. He wasn't built to fake it. Not in song, not in life. Through the hunger, the cold, the silence, Neil Diamond learned the hardest truth of all. Art is born from isolation. Out of rejection came identity. Out of despair, beauty. The boy who once sang to survive had finally found his voice. In that lonely room above Birdland, his breath freezing in the night, the first notes of Solitary Man began to take shape. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous, but he had done what few ever could. He had survived the city that eats its dreamers alive and turned its cruelty into song. He once sang in the dark. Now the world lit its candles for him. The same man who had written songs in freezing rooms above Birdland now watched his melodies spill from car radios and jukeboxes, from wedding halls and neon bars into the everyday rhythm of America. But even as applause thundered and fame wrapped its glittering arms around him, Neil Diamond began to hear something faint and frightening in the silence between the cheers, his own heartbeat, heavy with loneliness. The louder the world sang his words, the quieter his soul became. It began in 1966 with a song that wasn't even meant for his voice. I'm a Believer. Pop Grenade, written for the Monkees, detonated across the globe. Over 1 million copies sold before it even hit store shelves. In one stroke, the anonymous songwriter became the architect of a phenomenon. But fame has a cruel habit of leaving its makers in the shadows. Neil's words made strangers fall in love. Yet he still walked home alone through the flickering glow of Manhattan, his shoes soaked in winter rain. I was happy for them, he later whispered, but I knew I had more to say, my own story. That story bled out of him in Solitary Man. It wasn't written for radio, it was written for survival. Every rejection, every empty night, every note carved out of hunger became a confession in sound. It didn't make him famous, it made him real. By 1969, America found its anthem. Sweet Caroline. 1 hour, one hotel room in Memphis, one moment of clarity, and a melody that would echo for half a century. He'd written it for the innocence of a child. But what came out was a song for everyone, a celebration of hope that refuses to die. When he first performed it, something sacred happened. The crowd didn't just listen, they joined. A single voice became thousands. It was magic, Neil said years later. They made the song theirs. From that night on, Sweet Caroline wasn't just music. It was a ritual of belonging. Stadiums erupted, wedding halls trembled, and strangers linked arms in harmony. Yet for the man who wrote it, each joyful chorus was followed by the echo of solitude. The world found unity in my melody, he said softly, while I remained the solitary man behind it. The 1970s crowned him king, but even kings bleed. Cracklin Rosie songs sung blue, beautiful noise, America. Every record soared higher, every show louder, every stage larger. The world saw fireworks. He felt fire. At the Greek Theater in Los Angeles, 1972, he performed 10 nights to roaring crowds. Hot August Night became gospel, selling 2 million copies and staying on Australia's charts for 2 years. But behind the curtain, the man who gave joy to millions would collapse into a chair, drenched in sweat, his chest heaving. You give all of yourself every night, he said, and when it's over, there's nothing left. His dressing rooms were silent cathedrals of exhaustion. Makeup half melted, the mirror fogged with breath, his reflection barely recognizable. The applause thundered outside, but inside Neil only heard the hum of the lights and the faint tremor in his own hands. Before he could breathe, Broadway came calling. The Winter Garden Theater, 20 sold-out nights, the first rock artist ever to conquer a stage meant for Sinatra. Columbia Records crowned him with a $5 million contract, an unimaginable fortune for a boy who once ate on 35 cents a day. But glory, as always, demanded blood. Neil rehearsed 12-hour days, rewriting lyrics until his fingers cramped, singing until his throat shredded, recording until dawn blurred into daylight. His spine ached like it carried the weight of every note. I'd look in the mirror, he later admitted, and not recognize the man staring back. I was chasing perfection, and perfection was killing me. When Hollywood came calling, he couldn't resist the promise of a new canvas. Jonathan Livingston Seagull, 1973, was supposed to soar. Instead, it crashed. The film flopped, losing millions, but his music took flight, winning him a Grammy and the world's praise. Yet even in triumph, he tasted bitterness. The director had cut and rearranged his compositions without permission. It felt like watching someone edit my soul, he confessed. Betrayal stung worse than failure. From that day on, he swore never to make another film unless he had full control. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. By 1980, the jazz singer came calling. Hollywood offered $3.5 million, the highest salary ever paid to a first-time actor. He took it, knowing full well the risk. The movie failed, critics sneered. But Neil's songs, Love on the Rocks, Hello Again, America, rose like phoenixes from the wreckage. They can laugh at the movie, he told reporters, but they can't touch the songs. Yet that defiance hid the truth. The fatigue was consuming him. Decades of touring, performing, and creating had ground his body down to its limits. He sang through fevers, through back pain so fierce it left him gasping between verses. His team would find him backstage trembling, whispering, "Just one more show." And then came the night the music almost stopped. Mid-performance, he felt something give, a blinding pain down his spine. The microphone fell. The crowd froze. Neil collapsed under the lights that once adored him. Hours later, doctors told him there was a tumor near his spinal cord. Surgery would take 12 hours. Before being wheeled into the operating room, he wrote letters to his children, fearing he might never wake, or worse, wake without his voice. When he finally opened his eyes, everything was white. Walls, light, silence. He tried to speak. Nothing came. Panic, then a whisper. "Can I still sing?" The nurse nodded through tears. Neil smiled, weak and broken but alive. From 35 cents a day to $5 million deals, from cold apartments to sold-out arenas, from hunger to hysteria, Neil Diamond had conquered charts, filled stadiums, and turned silence into song. But the climb had carved scars no audience could see. Behind every ovation was a man who gave too much, loved too deeply, and sang until the music itself began to hurt. "The stage," he once said, "is where I'm most alive and where I die a little each night." And so when the lights dimmed and the crowd's roar faded into memory, all that remained was the man and his melody, bruised, unbroken, and still singing into the storm. Because every legend learns the same truth. The higher you climb, the closer you stand to the thunder. The roar of the crowd faded, and for the first time, he realized how loud silence could be. Every night, Neil Diamond could make thousands sing in perfect harmony. But when the lights dimmed and the stage fell quiet, he faced the one sound that fame could never drown out, the silence of his own home. He had conquered the world's applause. Yet in the stillness after each ovation, he could feel another kind of distance growing. The kind measured not in miles, but in love slipping away. Before the spotlights, before the fame, there was Jay. Pausner, the girl who believed in him when no one else did. They met in Brooklyn at Erasmus Hall High School, two dreamers too young to know that dreams could break hearts. She was bright, gentle, already sure of her place in the world. He was restless, chasing something he couldn't yet name. They fell in love not through grand gestures, but in the quiet spaces, the walk home from school, the notes passed between classes, the late-night laughter over instant coffee in a tiny apartment that smelled of ink and hope. She became a teacher. He became a husband with more ambition than money, more songs than sleep. Their wedding in 1963 was small, almost secret, but to them it felt infinite, a promise made between two people who believed love could outlast struggle. In those early years, there was music and laughter. Jay graded papers while Neil scribbled lyrics by the cracked window, the cold Brooklyn air biting his fingers. When he played, she listened, smiling through exhaustion, whispering, "Maybe one day the world will hear you." And in 1964 and 1966, the world gave them two reasons to believe. Marjorie and Elin, daughters born from love and faith. Nights were short, money was thin, but hearts were full. He'd rock the babies to sleep, humming half-finished songs that would one day echo across the world. For a while, the dream and the love seemed enough. Then came success, sudden, blinding, and merciless. "I'm a Believer" exploded across America, but the applause that filled arenas began to empty their home. He was always gone, writing, recording, touring. Jay stayed behind, a mother watching her husband turn into a photograph. "He belonged to everyone now," she once said quietly to a friend. "Just not to us." She'd put the girls to bed, then watch him smile on TV, proud but aching. In interviews, he looked happy. In her kitchen, she looked lost. And when he called, his voice came from somewhere unreachable. "I'm fine," she'd say. "We're fine." But they both knew they weren't. Neil later admitted, "The kids cried, my wives cried, I cried, but I kept walking." He was torn between two worlds, the one he built with his hands and the one he built with his heart. Fame demanded the first. The second quietly fell apart. By 1969, love had grown thin beneath the weight of absence. There was no scandal, no shouting, no villain, just exhaustion. Two good people standing on opposite sides of a dream too heavy to carry together. The night he left, the rain fell soft against the glass. Jay stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes dry. Their daughters slept down the hall. He kissed them goodbye, whispering, "I'll be back soon." She nodded, but her silence said everything. As he stepped into the night, the streetlights flickered against puddles, and somewhere far off, a jukebox played one of his songs. The sound followed him like a ghost. He walked away from the only home that had ever truly been his. Not because he stopped loving it, but because he didn't know how to stay. Years later, he would say, "You can't take your kids on the road." And I took the road. He had given the world his voice, but lost the small sacred music of his own family. No crowd, no contract, no curtain call could drown out the sound of that empty house or the echo of a promise that once believed love could outsing the world. The ink on the first divorce papers was barely dry. When fate dealt its cruel encore, even before the echoes of goodbye had faded, a new name began to whisper its way into Neil Diamond's life: Marcia Murphy. Some would later say her shadow had already lingered at the edges of his first marriage, that she appeared in the background long before he dared to admit he'd been seen again. But whatever the truth, she arrived not as temptation, but as quiet mercy. A young TV production assistant with soft eyes and a steadiness that disarmed him, Marcia didn't fall in love with the legend the world would soon worship. She fell for the man still learning how to be whole after breaking. He met her in the twilight between endings and beginnings, when fame was only starting to flicker and his heart was still limping from the wreckage of lost promises. Marcia didn't try to fix him. She simply stayed patient, unafraid of his silences. She didn't ask for songs, Neil would recall. She just listened. In her, he found something he had never known: peace without performance. For the first time in years, the noise inside him quieted. He once described that moment as the first breath after drowning. She became his second chance at love, at faith, at being seen not as a star, but as a man who still believed in tenderness. When they married in 1969, it felt like the world itself was exhaling, as if after years of loneliness, he'd finally come home. Their Los Angeles house on Laurel Canyon shimmered with the brightness of beginnings. Golden light spilled through tall windows, guitars leaned against every wall, and the scent of morning coffee mingled with half-written lyrics. Neil played piano barefoot in the kitchen, the boys' laughter echoing through hallways not yet haunted by absence. Marcia sat nearby, sometimes humming, sometimes just watching, her eyes full of quiet pride as he searched for melodies that would one day fill stadiums. "Those were the songs born out of stillness," he once said, "out of being loved, simply for being me." In those early years, love felt like rhythm, steady, sure, alive. Jesse came first in 1970, his cries blending with the chords of Cracklin Rosie. 8 years later, Micah followed, his arrival timed almost poetically with the first notes of You Don't Bring Me Flowers. Family and fame danced around each other, fragile but luminous. Neil recorded their first words on tape, carried baby photos in his guitar case, and whispered lullabies that would one day echo from stages on the other side of the world. There were moments, fleeting but real, when even he believed he'd outrun the loneliness that had once written his songs. "I thought I'd learned," he later said almost to himself. "This time I was sure I could have both, the dream and the love." For a while he did, and it was beautiful, achingly beautiful. The kind of happiness that makes tragedy when it finally comes feel almost unspeakable. But dreams once again demanded blood. Fame had given Neil everything, everything except rest. The 1970s turned him from a man with a guitar into a phenomenon, a one-man hurricane of sold-out nights and flashing cameras. Cracklin Rosie songs sung blue, beautiful noise, America, each hit brighter than the last, each tour longer, louder, lonelier. The road devoured him whole. Hotel rooms blurred into airports. Applause replaced heartbeat. The stage lights became his only sunrise. At home, Marcia kept the world from collapsing. She raised their sons with photographs instead of presents. Birthdays, school plays, dinners lit by one missing shadow. The boys learned to recognize their father's voice through television speakers instead of bedtime stories. "It was strange," Jesse said years later. "The world had him. We didn't." Yet Marcia stayed strong, silent, believing that love could survive the miles. "He always came back," she told a friend softly. "Just not all of him." By the late 1980s, the cracks that success had carved were no longer invisible. Neil was bone-tired, a man hollowed out by applause. He wrote through pain, toured through fever, smiled through the exhaustion that no spotlight could hide. "You can't give the world your soul," he once admitted, and still have enough left for home. The marriage unraveled the way seasons end, quietly, inevitably. No slammed doors, no shattered glass, just distance, the kind that doesn't make a sound when it breaks. Conversations grew shorter. The laughter that once filled their kitchen turned into echoes. And when they sat across from each other, it was the silence, not the arguments, that finally won. "I think we just ran out of road," Neil said. "The touring never stopped until love did." By 1995, after 26 years of trying to hold on to something that had already slipped through their fingers, they let go. No scandal, no cruelty, just two hearts too bruised to keep pretending they could heal each other. The divorce settlement stunned Hollywood, a reported $150 million, one of the largest in entertainment history. But when asked if he regretted it, Neil shook his head. "She got enough to live on for the rest of her life," he said quietly, "and she was worth every penny." There was no resentment, only the kind of grief that wears a kind face. He had spent his life building an empire, yet no amount of gold could buy back a single night he hadn't been home. When the papers were signed and the lawyers gone, the house fell unbearably still. Two sons stood between them, old enough to understand, too young to escape the ache. Jesse packed for college. Micah stayed behind, his camera already capturing the emptiness his father had left behind. Neil hugged them both, his voice cracking on a promise. "I'll call every day." They nodded but didn't answer. Sometimes silence is love, love that hurts too much to say aloud. Years later, Jesse would recall, "Dad was always chasing something bigger, something we couldn't compete with." Micah, quieter, said, "He was there when it mattered, even when he wasn't." And Neil, when asked about them, smiled the way men do when they've run out of apologies. "They turned out better than I deserved," he said. He had written songs that healed millions, but at home, love had gone off key. The man who had promised the world melody had lost the harmony closest to his heart, and in that echo, even applause began to sound like regret. "I gave her years of songs," he once whispered, "but not enough days at home." When the final box was carried out and the door clicked shut, Neil Diamond stood in the quiet ruins of his own success. A man with everything the world could give and nothing the heart could keep. The piano was untouched. The photographs smiled without memory. The air itself felt haunted. He had spent a lifetime turning silence into song. But now, for the first time, the silence sang back, and it was louder than any crowd he'd ever heard. After all the songs about love and loss, Neil Diamond thought he had sung his heart empty. But life, ever cruel and kind, wasn't done with him yet. By 1996, Neil Diamond was 55, old enough to have tasted everything, young enough to still ache for something real. The applause had quieted, the stages were smaller, the silences longer. He had spent decades chasing music across continents, collecting broken promises the way others collected souvenirs. And then in Australia, he met Ray Farley, a woman who didn't see the legend, only the man who'd forgotten how to rest. She wasn't blinded by the fame, nor frightened by its ruins. She looked at him the way sunlight looks at dust, gently, revealing what had always been there, just waiting to be seen. Ray was a businesswoman, sharp and grounded, her beauty wrapped in calm intelligence. She carried her own quiet history of hurt, but she met life with grace, not bitterness. When their paths crossed, Neil was still nursing the ache of a 26-year marriage that had dissolved under the weight of fame. He was restless, pacing through success like a man searching for a door that didn't exist. Ray was stillness, the kind that made noise retreat. "Ray made me feel young again." He would later say, "She reminded me of who I was before the noise." What began as friendship became something deeper, something steadier. Not the fever of first love, but the warmth that builds when two people stop running. For the first time in years, he found peace in simplicity. Their days had rhythm, their nights had quiet. They walked together through vineyards and narrow coastal paths, talked about everything and nothing. When Neil played unfinished songs, Ray listened not as a fan but as a mirror. Honest, patient, unafraid of his flaws. "She made me believe I could still write love songs," he told a friend once. Not from memory, from truth. She joined him on tours sometimes, the silent compass behind the chaos, content to watch from the wings while the world cheered. Home was no longer a place, it was a person. Then fate shifted the balance. Around 2003, Ray's back injury changed everything. Surgery followed, risky, invasive, and slow to heal. For once, Neil stopped running. He stayed. He sat by her bedside through long nights that blurred into mornings, holding her hand through pain he couldn't fix. She was in pain, he later said, voice breaking, and all I could do was hold her hand. The music stopped, but love became something deeper. Devotion stripped of glamour, loyalty without applause. He cooked, read to her, and in the quiet they learned what endurance really meant. It wasn't a grand romance anymore, it was grace under weight. But even love has a lifespan. By the late 2000s, as Neil neared 67, the distance crept in. It didn't crash like a storm. It drifted in softly, like dust settling on a piano no one played anymore. Laughter turned to memory. Long talks shortened into sighs. They were still kind, still gentle, but the rhythm was gone. One evening, as the sun fell behind their Los Angeles home, Ray began to pack in silence. No argument, no accusation, just a look that said everything words could not. Neil stood by the doorway, unable to stop her. Sometimes, he said later, love doesn't die, it just runs out of road. In 2008, after 12 years together, Rai returned to Australia. Neil stayed behind, older, quieter, watching the house fill with echoes. When asked about her years later, he smiled with the tenderness of a man who had lived too much and learned too late. I loved her with all my heart, he said softly. Rai was the woman who made me feel alive again. But sometimes, love just isn't enough. And so she became another verse in the ballad of his life, the one not sung in stadiums, but in solitude. For Neil Diamond, Ray Farley was never just a chapter. She was the bridge between the man the world worshipped and the human being he was trying to remember. When the final light faded from their story, all that remained was gratitude and a quiet room where the last note lingered, waiting for silence to hold it. He had spent a lifetime chasing noise, applause, headlines, endless tours that blurred the line between purpose and exhaustion. And then when the world finally grew quiet, love came softly. Not as thunder or lightning, but as a whisper. Her name was Katie. Neil Diamond met Katie McNeil around 2009 when she was hired to manage one of his tours. He was nearly 70, weathered and wise, his hands already trembling with the first shadows of illness he hadn't yet named. She was 29 years younger, sharp, intuitive, confident. But when she looked at him, she didn't see a legend. She saw a man still capable of laughter, of gentleness, of one more song. By then, he later said, I wasn't looking for love anymore. It found me anyway. Their connection began quietly backstage between rehearsals and paperwork. She'd watch him rehearse, carefully rewriting a single line until it felt right, and he'd look up to find her smiling, not as a fan, but as someone who understood the weight of perfection. Katie had calm, he said once. She steadied the storm I carried everywhere. What started as professionalism turned into companionship, then something deeper. The kind of love that doesn't rush, but stays. They married in 2012 in a small private ceremony under the California sun. No crowds, no spotlight, just close friends, his children, and a man who had finally learned to choose peace over performance. For a while, life was soft again. Their mornings began with quiet coffee on the porch, her hand resting on his as he strummed a guitar without pressure, without expectation. The music was no longer for charts or critics. It was for them. They walked through gardens, cooked simple meals, shared the kind of laughter that comes from two people who've both been lonely for too long. She gave me something I thought I'd lost, Neil said later. A home I didn't have to sing for. But love, even the tender kind, is not without its trials. The years brought fatigue, medical appointments, and days when Neil felt more like a patient than a partner. The disease that had begun as a tremor was tightening its grip. Katie became more than a wife. She became his caretaker, his defender, his voice when his own faltered. There were moments of frustration, of silence, too heavy to lift. Sometimes she'd find him at the piano in the middle of the night, staring at the keys he could no longer play the way he used to. You don't have to, she'd whisper. You've already given enough. He'd shake his head. The music's still in there, he'd answer softly. It just takes longer to come out. They had arguments, not about love, but about fear, about the future, about how to hold on to joy when the body forgets how. Katie once said in an interview, "He doesn't need to be Neil Diamond for me. I just need him to be Neil." That devotion kept him going. When the world learned of his Parkinson's diagnosis in 2018 and the touring stopped, she was the one who helped him let go. Not of music, but of the weight to perform. "She saved me from needing to prove anything," he told a friend. "For the first time, I could just be." Now in their quiet Colorado home, they live surrounded by mountains and stillness. The man who once sang to millions sings only for her. Some evenings, as snow drifts past the windows, Katie sits beside him on the couch and he hums the old songs under his breath. "Sweet Caroline," "Hello Again," "Love on the Rocks." She listens, eyes closed, smiling through tears. There are no spotlights, no audiences, no need for applause. Just two souls who have finally learned the hardest harmony of all, staying. He once said, "Katie came into my life when I needed grace the most. She taught me that love isn't loud, it's patient. It's the sound of someone staying." And so the legend who spent his youth chasing the roar of the crowd now ends his days in the hush of devotion, where the only standing ovation left is the heartbeat beside his own. Sometimes when the house falls silent and Katie drifts to sleep, Neil finds himself staring at the ceiling, thinking about the kind of father he once hoped to be and the man who taught him how. The love, the distance, the mistakes, they all lead him back to one place, Brooklyn, and the voice of his father. When the nights grow quiet in Colorado, Neil sometimes finds himself drifting back to Brooklyn, not to the noise or the neon, but to the voice that first taught him how to believe. His father, Akiba Keeve Diamond, was not a man of fame or fortune. He was a merchant, a dreamer, a man who carried dignity in his hands, even when they were empty. It was Keeve who taught his son that work had meaning, that integrity mattered more than applause. He didn't say much, Neil once recalled, but when he did, it stuck. In those early years, when money was scarce and hope was a fragile thing, Neil watched his father move from job to job, always chasing enough. He remembered the smell of fabric from the dry goods store, the sound of coins clinking in a pocket half full. "He worked harder than anyone I've ever known," Neil said, "and he did it all for us." Even during the war, when Kiev was stationed far from home, he would send letters to little Neil, pages that spoke not of fear, but of faith. It was from those letters that Neil learned rhythm, the music of words, the heartbeat of storytelling. When Ka returned from the army, the family was never rich, but they were together, and that to Neil was enough. Years later, when fame came and the world began to chant his name, he would still call his father before every tour. He wanted to know if I was eating enough. Neil once laughed. I could be on top of the charts, and he'd still ask about soup. Then, in the mid-1980s, cancer came quietly. Neil was in the middle of recording, his schedule packed, his name everywhere. And suddenly, none of it mattered. He flew home, sat beside the hospital bed, and held the same hand that once guided him across Brooklyn streets. "It's okay," Heave whispered. "You did good, son." Neil would later say it was the hardest moment of his life, not because of death itself, but because it came from the only man he'd ever wanted to make proud. When his father passed, Neil didn't write for weeks. The guitar gathered dust. The piano stayed silent. "I couldn't find the melody," he said. "It felt like the world had gone out of tune." But one night, unable to sleep, he picked up a pen. What came out wasn't a song yet. It was a prayer. A letter to the man who had taught him everything except how to say goodbye. Years later, when asked what success meant to him, Neil simply smiled and said, "It means my dad was right to believe in me." And in that quiet answer lived everything. The grief, the gratitude, and the unspoken music of a son still reaching for his father's voice. In every note he sings, time moves on, they say, but grief never really leaves. It lingers, soft and unseen, like a shadow that remembers the shape of what once was. After their father's passing, Neil found himself clinging to the one constant that fame could never touch. His older brother Harvey. They had grown up shoulder to shoulder in Brooklyn's cramped apartments. Two boys sharing one bed, one battered radio, and one impossible dream. Harvey was the protector, steady, kind, and endlessly patient. When Neil first began to string together words and melody, Harvey was always there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, listening with that quiet smile only an older brother could wear. "He was my first audience," Neil once said. "He was the only one who believed my songs were good before anyone else did." As Neil's world grew louder, Harvey stayed small, a steady rhythm of work, family, and pride that never needed applause. At holidays, he'd raise his glass and joke, "Just remember me when you're famous." And Neil always promised he would. Even when the world screamed his name, Neil never missed Harvey's call. There was always laughter, always that shared language only brothers understand. Half memory, half love. Then in the early 2000s came the silence. Harvey had fallen ill suddenly, brutally, the kind of illness that crept in quietly, then refused to leave. Neil was touring again, the spotlight blinding, the crowds deafening. But behind every chorus of Sweet Caroline was the steady ache of fear. When he got the call, he flew home immediately, his guitar left behind, his heart somewhere between the stage and the hospital room. He found Harvey pale but smiling, still teasing, still asking if Neil had written anything new. "Not lately," Neil whispered, gripping his hand. "I'm waiting for you to tell me which one's good." But the days grew harder. Machines hummed where laughter once filled the air. Harvey fought bravely, quietly, the way he had lived. Neil never left his side. He sang softly in the sterile light, the same way he had sung in their Brooklyn bedroom decades before, hoping the melody would hold his brother here just a little longer. When the time came, Neil didn't say goodbye. He couldn't. He just sat there, holding the same hand that once clapped for him in the kitchen until the room went still. For months afterward, he withdrew from the world. He stopped performing. He wrote in silence, haunted by unfinished songs and the echo of Harvey's voice. "I lost my first believer," he said quietly, and for a long time the music didn't sound the same. Even now, years later, when the crowd sings along, Neil sometimes closes his eyes and listens beyond the noise. Sometimes he says, "I still hear him in the harmonies." Maybe that's how love survives. It doesn't vanish. It just changes seats. If Harvey was the rhythm of Neil Diamond's youth, then Rose was its heartbeat, the first and most faithful sound he ever knew. Before the world ever sang his songs, she was the one who sang to him softly off key, her voice trembling over the hiss of a cheap radio and the crackle of a frying pan. She was not just his mother. She was his first audience, his first believer, the quiet architect of a dream she never got to live herself. In the small Brooklyn apartment where hope and hunger shared the same table, Rose Diamond held the world together with two hands that never stopped working. She swed, she cooked, she prayed. When his father's temper frayed under the weight of unpaid bills, it was Rose who hummed through the tension, turning fear into lullabies. "Do good work," she would whisper, "and let the work speak for you." Years later, when reporters asked Neil where his music came from, he smiled through the ache of memory and said, "From my mother." She believed there was something beautiful hiding inside the noise. Fame took him far, to London, to Las Vegas, to the edge of exhaustion. But no matter how far he roamed, her voice found him. She called before every show, her tone half prayer, half command. "Sing from your heart, Noodle." The nickname embarrassed him in front of stagehands, but he cherished it in secret. For all the lights, all the standing ovations, it was her voice, not the crowds, that told him he had done enough. Then came 2006, and the song of her life began to fade. Her heart, worn from years of giving, could no longer keep time. She was fragile in body, but fierce in spirit, still reaching for his hand, as she had when he was a boy, trembling before his first school concert. Neil flew home, leaving the stage behind to sit by her side, watching the rhythm that had carried him through life slow, then soften. She looked at him one last time, her lips trembling into a smile. "Keep singing, sweetheart," she whispered. "That's how you stay close to me." After she was gone, he placed her photograph on his piano, the same piano she once dusted every morning before he played. Sometimes between songs, he still looks at it and smiles as if waiting for her to nod in approval. "My mother taught me how to love, how to work, how to believe," he once said. "Everything else was just the echo. And in that echo, soft, eternal, and invisible, she still lives. Every melody he writes still carries her hum somewhere beneath the notes. reminding the world that before there was applause, there was always a mother's song. By the time Neil had said goodbye to his mother, there were few people left who truly knew the boy he once was. Most of those who had shaped his life, his father, his brother, his quiet anchor at home, were now memories woven into his songs. And yet there was one last voice that had stood beside him through the decades. One more harmony that made the long road a little less lonely. Glen Campbell. They were kindred spirits, two men cut from the same cloth of melody and grit. Both had clawed their way out of humble beginnings. Both carried the ache of endless highways and empty hotel rooms, and both found their refuge on stage. They first met in the late 1960s, when music was exploding with color and rebellion. Glen's guitar sang where Neil's words spoke, and between them grew a quiet friendship, built not on fame but on understanding. We didn't need to talk much. Neil once said we just knew the weight that came with a song. Their bond deepened over the years. Studio sessions that stretched into dawn, phone calls that ended in laughter. Moments on tour buses when silence was the truest form of company. When Glen began struggling with Alzheimer's, Neil was among the first to reach out. The disease that steals memory, cruelest of all for a man who lived by them, slowly dimmed the brilliance that had once lit up every stage. "It broke my heart," Neil admitted quietly. He was fading, and there was nothing any of us could do but keep playing his songs. When Glen passed away in 2017, the loss cut deeper than applause could reach. Neil didn't give interviews, didn't make appearances. Instead, he wrote one line: simple, devastating, and eternal. "Goodbye, my friend. You taught me how to find light, even when the melody fades." It was more than a tribute, it was confession. For decades, Glen had been the mirror that reflected Neil's own struggles, the reminder that even legends are human, and even music can't out-sing time. After the funeral, Neil sat alone at his piano, the same instrument that had carried so many ghosts before. The keys were cold beneath his fingers, and the room was quiet. Then softly he began to hum, a tune half his, half Glen's, because that's what friendship leaves behind. Not silence, but an unfinished song waiting to be played again someday. After a lifetime of saying goodbye to others, his father, his brother, his mother, his closest friends, Neil Diamond was about to face a farewell of his own. But this time, he wasn't losing someone he loved. He was losing himself, piece by piece, note by note. It began quietly, the way all great tragedies do. His hands, once graceful and sure, began to tremble. His voice, that thunder that once filled stadiums, sometimes betrayed him with a quiver. Simple things, a glass of water, a button, a guitar string, suddenly became battles. And yet, every morning he still woke with the same thought. Maybe today it will all go away. But it didn't. The man who once commanded tens of thousands with a single gesture now fought against his own fingers, against muscles that no longer obeyed the rhythm he'd lived by all his life. He had known pain before, back in 1979 at the height of his glory. He had collapsed on stage, the applause turning into panic, the lights blurring as he fell. Doctors found a spinal tumor and rushed him into a 12-hour surgery. Before the anesthesia claimed him, he scribbled farewell notes to his children, terrified that he'd never wake or that he'd wake in silence. But when he opened his eyes, his first words were a whisper that carried a lifetime of fear. "Can I still sing?" He could. And for 40 more years he did, until life demanded another fight. In January 2018, that fight arrived. Parkinson's disease. 3 words that stole the ground beneath him. It can't be. He told the doctor, "I have work to do." But Parkinson's doesn't negotiate. It creeps in, slow, cruel, patient. It takes your rhythm, your balance, your certainty. For a performer, it is the most merciless of thieves. The man who once glided across the stage now stumbled on flat ground. His voice still burned, but the vessel that carried it had begun to betray him. "I didn't want to accept it," he confessed. "For a long time I kept pretending I could still outrun it. But time is undefeated." 2 years later, standing before his mirror, he faced a reflection he no longer recognized. The legend replaced by a fragile man holding on to faith with trembling hands. And so, with tears in his eyes, he made the hardest decision of his life. After more than half a century, he stepped away from the stage. "It was with great reluctance," he said. but this is the hand God's given me, and I have to make the best of it. When he announced his retirement, millions wept, not only because their hero was ill, but because they knew he would have sung until his last breath if his body had allowed it. Today, at 84, the disease has advanced and the toll is visible. The once fiery gestures are slower now, his steps deliberate, his voice softer, yet his eyes still carry that spark of defiance. Some days are kind, others are merciless. His fingers stiffen, his muscles rebel, and exhaustion hangs heavy on his frame. But even on those days, he hums. He hums to remember, to resist, to live. I still sing, he says, because when I do, everything inside me still works together. There is courage in that. Not the kind that fills stadiums, but the quiet kind that survives in hospital corridors and long sleepless nights. He spends his days now in his Colorado home, wrapped in mountain light and the steady presence of his wife, Katie. The snow falls softly outside. Inside his piano waits. He writes when he can, plays when he's able. Some days the tremor is too strong, but he still touches the keys gently, reverently, as if reminding them that the music still belongs to him. The disease may have taken his balance, but not his will. The rhythm may falter, but the melody endures. Parkinson's is a cruel companion, unpredictable, unrelenting, stripping away control one muscle at a time. It has taken his ease, his freedom, but not his grace. Somehow, he says, a calm has moved in. I like it. I'm easier on people now, easier on myself. It is the voice of a man who has stopped fighting time and started embracing life, however it comes. He no longer performs for the world, but the world still sings his songs. Sweet Caroline echoes through stadiums, the same so good, so good, so good, now carrying new meaning, not just celebration, but survival. And when he hears it, he smiles because somewhere in that chorus, he's still there. The man, the music, the fight. The fire that once roared from the stage now glows softly within him. Steady, unbroken, eternal. Neil Diamond has shown the world that even as the body fails, the spirit can still rise, trembling, imperfect, but undefeated. His life is no longer a concert. It is a testament because in the end, what matters is not how loudly we sing, but how bravely we keep the music alive. Now at 84 years old, Neil Diamond lives a life that feels like the final verse of a timeless ballad, quiet, golden, and deeply human. His net worth today stands at an astonishing $300 million, a testament to 6 decades of relentless artistry, sold-out tours, and songs that stitched themselves into America's collective soul. Yet behind every dollar lies a story of hunger, faith, and the long climb from a Brooklyn boy with a $9 guitar to one of the most beloved voices in music history. He makes his home in Colorado in an $8 million mountainside estate that seems to float between earth and heaven. The property spans over 10,000 square feet, built of timber, glass, and quiet majesty. The air smells of pine and snow, and the silence carries the faint echo of old melodies. Inside, the great room glows with soft light, reflecting off gold and platinum records that line the walls. Not trophies, but memories. His private recording studio sits beside a large bay window that looks out toward the Rockies. A grand piano waits there, keys slightly worn, where Neil still writes when the morning sun touches the glass. In the garage rest pieces of his journey, a 1968 Cadillac Eldorado he bought after his first $1 million record, a Bentley Continental for his years of success, and a Mercedes S-Class for the quiet drives he now prefers. There's also the small yacht moored in Marina del Rey, his retreat for reflection during the rare moments he sought the ocean's calm. Inside his Colorado home, he still keeps the same worn guitar from his youth. The $9 relic that began it all, mounted beside a framed lyric sheet from Sweet Caroline. Despite the wealth, Neil's life today feels less like luxury and more like gratitude. Everything I have, he once said, came from the same place: hope. Over the years, he has donated millions of dollars to charities supporting Parkinson's research, children's hospitals, and veterans rehabilitation programs. He prefers his giving quiet and private, never for headlines. I've been blessed, he once told a friend, and the only thing worth more than success is what you give back. His family remains his true treasure. His wife, Katie McNeil, has been both his rock and his refuge, a steady presence through his battles with Parkinson's, his quiet muse, and the one who helps him find calm in every storm. His 4 children, Marjorie, Ellen, Jessie, and Micah, now grown, often gather in the Colorado home with their children, filling the house with laughter. Neil loves those moments most. They remind me that life isn't about the spotlight, he says. It's about who's sitting in the front row when the lights go out. Though he no longer tours, Neil's music continues to move the world. His Broadway musical, A Beautiful Noise, celebrates his life and legacy, drawing standing ovations every night. Each time the audience sings the final chorus of Sweet Caroline, Neil smiles. Not for the fame, but for the connection. They're still singing, he once said, and that means the music's still alive. These days, mornings begin slow. He takes a walk through his garden, cane in hand, the Colorado wind brushing his face. The snow catches the sunlight like the reflection of an old spotlight, softer now but eternal. He often sits by his piano pressing a few keys, not to compose, but to remember. I used to chase the world, he said recently. Now I let it come to me. There's no regret in his voice, only peace, the kind that comes when a man has given everything he had and found beauty even in surrender. Neil Diamond's life is not just a tale of fame or fortune. It is the song of a man who turned loneliness into art, who made millions sing while fighting battles the world could not see, who gave his soul so completely that the echo will never fade. From poverty to platinum, from pain to peace. He has lived proof that greatness isn't measured by applause, but by endurance. By how long you can keep singing when the music hurts. So tonight, wherever you are, if one of his songs ever lifted your spirit, brought back a memory, or reminded you to believe again, take a moment to honor that gift. Leave a like, share this story, or simply whisper a quiet thank you. Not just for the legend, but for the man, the father, the husband, the poet who gave everything to turn silence into song. May your own days be long, your health strong, and your home full of light. May your heart stay as rich as Neil Diamond's melodies, and may you too keep your rhythm alive. No matter how softly the music plays, because, as his life reminds us, you don't need a stage to shine. You just need a heart brave enough to keep singing.